10 Minutes in a Life by Anonymous from The Argosy, edited by Mrs. Henry Wood. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Minutes in a Life. In the year 1065 of the Hegira, corresponding to 1687 of the Christian era, on the second day of the feast of Bayram, a large group of Mussulmans were assembled in a circle before the mosque of Saint Sophia. Some were standing and others sitting cross-legged on carpets spread upon the sand. By degrees the group increased as the Muslims issued from the mosque, and as passers-by, prompted by curiosity, remained to see what was going on. In the midst of a crowd of smokers, a young man of remarkably handsome features, though somewhat bronzed by an Asiatic sun, was seated before a small table which was covered with swords and brass bowls. He was dressed in a close jacket of green silk, admirably fitted to set off his light and graceful figure, a girdle of antelope skin, on which some mysterious characters were inscribed in silver, confined a pair of loose trousers, which were drawn close at the ankle. This light and attractive dress was completed by a Phrygian cap, from the top of which hung a small musical bell. By this costume, at once graceful and fantastic, it was easy to recognize one of those jugglers whom the feast of Bayram drew every year to Stamboul, and to whom was usually given the name of Zingaro. The juggler performed his exploits without appearing to notice the admiration he excited. He took a pigeon's egg from a small moss basket, and placing it upright on the table, struck it with the edge of his sword without injuring the shell. An incredulous bystander took the egg to examine it, but the slight pressure of his fingers served to destroy the frail object that had resisted the blow of the scimitar. This act of dexterity was followed by many others. The boldness of the young man terrified the usually impassive Turks, and what was yet more surprising, he made them smile by the amusing stories he related. Persons of his profession were generally silent, and their only power of amusement lay in their fingers' ends. But this man possessed the varied qualities of an Indian juggler and an Arabian storyteller. One of the most enthusiastic admirers of the performance was a man apparently about 40 years old, whose carpet was placed in the front circle, and whose dress denoted him to be of superior rank. It was the Bostanji Bassa, superintendent of the gardens and keeper of the privy purse of the Grand Signior. The tricks ended, the young man completed his story and gathered up his implements as if to depart. "Stop," said the Bostanji Bassa. "Since you are such a magician, will you tell me the Sultan's favorite flower?" "The poppy of Aleppo, it is red," replied the juggler, without a moment's hesitation. "At what time does the Sultan sleep?" resumed the Bostanji. "Never," said the juggler. The Bassa started and looked anxiously around him, fearing lest other ears had heard this answer. Then, beckoning the juggler to approach, and lowering his voice, he asked, "Can you name the Sultan's favorite wife?" "Asarach," replied the diviner. The Bostanji put his fingers on his lips in silence, and moving away, said, "Follow me." The young man took up his yataghan, and, leaving the remainder of his effects to be carried by a slave, followed his guide towards the great door of the palace. The history of successive sultans often presents little beyond the melancholy spectacle of a throne at the mercy of a lawless soldiery. Mahmud was not the first of his race who sought to free the seraglio from those formidable guardians. Suleiman III had also formed this perilous design, but he was put to death by the Janissaries, led by Mustapha, his uncle, who came from the Morea for the ostensible purpose of defending the emperor, but in reality to seize upon his throne. The Sultan Mustapha, who had commenced his reign in such a tragic manner, experienced all the anxiety and uneasiness which must ever attend the acts of a usurper and tyrant. Sordid, suspicious, and perfidious, he broke through every promise he had made to the Janissaries, whose creature, nevertheless, he was. Instead of doubling their pay, he diminished it. Instead of lessening the taxes, he doubled them. He lived buried in the depths of his palace, the care of which he had confided to the Greek soldiery, notwithstanding the murmurs of the legitimate guards. The mutes, dwarfs, and buffoons of the palace could alone obtain access to his presence. At the time the juggler was amusing the subjects of his Highness, Mustapha was seated cross-legged on his divan, seeking to drive away his ennui by watching the columns of fragrant smoke as they slowly rose from the long tube of his narghileh. A slave stood beside him, holding a feathered fan of various colors. The buffoons of the palace had vainly tried to extort a smile from their master. The impassibility of the Grand Signior gave them to understand that their time was ill chosen, and that mirth would be dangerous. They had, therefore, one after the other quitted the apartment, waiting to re-enter at the good pleasure of the prince. The palace was silent. Shortly the hangings opposite the divan were gently raised, and a man stood in respectful attitude before Mustapha. "What wouldst thou?" asked the Sultan. The Bostanji Bassa, for it was he, replied briefly, according to the custom of the seraglio, "A juggler stands without. He might perchance amuse your Highness." The Sultan made an impatient sign in the negative. "This man," continued the Bassa, "knows strange things. He can read the future." "Let him come in." The Bostanji bowed profoundly and retired. Black slaves, armed with drawn scimitars, surrounded the imperial sofa when the juggler was introduced. After a slight salutation, the young man leaned gracefully on his yataghan, awaiting the orders of the Sultan. "Thy name?" demanded Mustapha. "Mehaleh." "Thy country?" "Jugglers have no country." "Thy age?" "I was 5 years old when you first girded on the sword of Ottoman." "Whence comest thou?" "From the Morea, signor," replied the juggler, pronouncing the words with emphasis. The Sultan remained silent for a moment, but soon added gaily, "Since you can read the future, I will put your knowledge to the proof. When people know the future, they ought to know the past." You say right, signor. He who sees the evening star rise on the horizon has but to turn his head to view the last rays of the setting sun. Well, tell me how I made my ablutions yesterday. The first with Canary wine, the second with wine of Cyprus, and the third with that of Chios. The chief of the believers smiled and stroked his beard. He was indeed in the habit of derogating in this respect, as in many others, from the prescriptions of the Koran. Knowest thou, replied the sovereign, whom the Zingaro's answer had put into a pleasant humour, knowest thou that I could have thee beheaded? Doubtless, said the juggler, undauntedly, as you did the Spanish merchant who watered his wine before he sold it to you. Mustafa applauded the knowledge of the magician. He hesitated, nevertheless, before he ventured to put the dreaded question that tyrants, who are never superstitious, never fail to demand of those who can read the stars. How long have I to live? The Grand Seigneur assumed a persuasive tone, and even condescended to flatter the organ of destiny in hopes of obtaining a favourable answer. "Thou art a wonderful youth," said he. "Thou knowest things of which, besides myself, the mutes only possess the secret. I should wish to keep thee in my palace. I will make thee richer than all the merchants of Galatea, if thou wilt tell me the year when I must die." Mehalle approached the Sultan, and, taking his hand, appeared to study the lines of his palm with great attention. Having finished his examination, he went to the window and fixed his eyes for some moments upon the heavens. "The fires of Bairam are lighting up the cupola of the Grand Mosque," said he slowly. "Night is at hand." Mustafa anxiously awaited the answer of the astrologer. The latter continued in a mysterious manner: "The declining day still eclipses the light of the constellations. I will answer you, signor, when the evening star appears." The Sultan made a movement of impatience. Anger was depicted in his countenance, and the look which he darted on the mutes showed Mehalle that he had incurred his Highness's displeasure. Curiosity, however, doubtless prevailed over every other feeling of the prince's mind, for turning to the young man he said: "I am little accustomed to wait. I will do so, however, if thou canst amuse me until the propitious hour arrives." "Would your Highness like to see some feats of juggling?" asked Mehalle, drawing his sabre from its scabbard. "No, no," exclaimed the Sultan, making the circles of slaves close in about him. "Leave thy arms." "Would you prefer a story, signor?" "Stories that lull an Arab to sleep under his tent? No, I must have something new. Of all known games there is but one I care for. I used to play it formerly, but now there is not a person in the palace who understands the chessboard." The juggler smiled, and taking an ebony box from a velvet bag, he presented it to the Sultan, whose wish he understood. The stern countenance of the Sultan relaxed at the sight, and the board was placed on the bowed back of a slave. Before commencing the game the Sultan said: "We are about to play, so far so good, but shouldst thou lose, what should I gain?" "Since your Highness does me the honor of playing against me, I will stake all that I possess. this scimitar and my liberty. But what if I win?" added the young man, folding his arms. "Shouldst thou win, I would give thee a slave." "For a free man? The stake is not equal." "I would add to it my finest courser." "I need him not. My feet are swifter than those of an Arab steed." "What wouldst thou then?" "I have a fancy, sublime signor. Until this day I have been nothing but a wanderer, wearing the dress of a juggler. Were I to complain of this I should be ungrateful, for this simple garb has ever seen me free and happy. I, however, renounce it. I become your slave. My mirth shall be for you alone. I will sing for you Indian songs, and above all, I will divine for none but you. In return I will ask but one thing. It is, if I win, to allow me to wear your royal mantle for 10 minutes, to sit upon the divan surrounded by slaves, and to place upon my head that dreaded turban whose fame has reached to the ends of the earth." The proposition of Mehalle was received with a burst of laughter from the Sultan. "Thou wouldst sit upon the seat of the Caliphs? Dost thou not fear the weight of this turban upon thy silly head? A fine figure thou wouldst make under the pelisse of Ottoman! I should like to see thee giving audience to the viziers and pashas." "It is in your Highness's power to afford yourself this pleasure." "Well," exclaimed Mustapha, "I will agree to the stake. A juggler upon the throne! Such a sight the East never saw." The game was short. Though he played with skill, the Sultan was checkmated. It was fairly done, and he pleasantly prepared to fulfill his engagement. Mustapha loosened his girdle, took off his pelisse, and laid down his turban, while a slave assisted to invest Mehalle in the royal garments. These preparations completed, the Sultan, dressed only in loose silken trousers and a richly embroidered vest, approached a clock, and, placing his finger on the dial plate, "When the hand shall mark the hour of 8," said he, "I shall have paid my wager, and then I will appoint you my astrologer." The juggler ascended the divan, and having placed his scimitar at his side, he ordered the door to be thrown open that the waiting courtiers might be admitted. The apartment, which the dim light of evening rendered obscure, was immediately filled with muftis and ulemas, As of Janissaries and Pashas, great officers of the Porte, and foreign ambassadors. He next ordered a new relay of guards to relieve those on duty, and then the withdrawal of all the personal attendants. It was the work of a moment. As the fresh soldiers were marching in, a sign from Mehalle caused the flambeau to be lighted, when, in the dazzling flood of illumination, he stood erect, received the homage of the assembly, and fixing more firmly on his head the scarlet feathered turban, the emblem of power, he cried, in a commanding tone, "Let the standard of the Prophet be raised on Saint Sophia. The people will salute it from afar at the fires of Bairam." At these words an officer stepped forth to execute the orders, but Mustapha, who had been sitting aside, at first amused and then alarmed, arose to prevent him. "Hagi Mohammed!" thundered the ad interim Sultan, "obey!" The Aa bowed and retired. Mehalle added, Let the imams repair to the mosques and offer up petitions for the new sultan. Kadiliskir, have the tomb of Mustafa opened in Scutari. The sultan tried to smile. Keepers of the treasury, continued Mihalle, distribute among the poor of Stambul the hoardings of the late sultan. Enough, buffoon! Exclaimed Mustafa in an agitated voice on seeing how readily his servants obeyed these strange orders. I still command, replied Mihalle with calm self-possession. The clock has not yet struck the hour of 8. Art thou then so impatient to know the fate that awaits thee? The courtiers were at a loss to understand the mysterious scene. They looked with terror on this bold young man, invested with the insignia of power, and the Bostanji was astonished at seeing his master tremble before a strolling juggler. Mustafa, continued the diviner, I am about to tell thee the time of thy death, for the evening star has risen. Mufti, advance. The president of the Umela came forward. The diviner proceeded. You who read every day the book of our Prophet and explain it to the people, tell me how avarice and usury, drunkenness and murder, perfidy and cruelty should be punished. The Mufti replied in a low, grave tone, By the Koran, any one of these crimes is deserving of death. Thou hearest, Mustafa, it is the Prophet who condemns thee. As he said this, he beckoned to the mutes. Mustafa tried to rush to the divan, but was seized by the slaves, who had learned to recognize the symbol of power which Mihalle wore, and the cord was passed around his neck. Thine hour has come. I am the son of Suleiman, who fell 15 years ago in this very place, pierced with wounds from thy sword. Thou hast counted the heads of every member of my family. Thou hast confounded the son of thy master with the child of a slave. I am the evening star. I am the Sultan Amurath. As he thus spoke, the young prince made a step forward. His lofty brow, his features, voice, manner, and commanding dignity of person inspired a deep emotion in the assembly. After a moment the cry went up, "Long live Amurath!" and at the same moment the body of Mustafa fell lifeless on the marble floor. The clock had struck 8. Before the hour hand had once again passed around the dial, largesse had been profusely scattered amongst the populace of Stambul, oaths of allegiance taken by officers of state, and the proclamation, His Highness, our very magnificent Lord and Master, Sultan Abdulaziz Amurath, has ascended the throne, trumpeted by the public crier before the mosque of Saint Sophia. End of 10 Minutes in a Life by Anonymous. Read by Carolyn in Istanbul, Turkey during Bayram 2015.